If you were to sit down and compile a list of the most important topics as they relate to the time period in American history known as the Wild West, what would you come up with? Most lists would probably cover the most popular subjects of the frontier, such as cowboys versus Native Americans, manifest destiny, gunfighting and outlaws, railroad expansion, gold mining, and just about any type of battle, civil war, or conflict you can think of. Funnily enough though, the most vital piece to lore of the Old West and how we think about this time period probably wouldn't be included: horses. Besides guns and their development throughout the 19th century, no other entity might have impacted all aspects of life in the West more than horses. Utilized by both European settlers, westward migrators, and Native Americans alike, horses were seen as prized possessions on the frontier, sometimes used as currency in and of themselves. To dissect their rich history in the United States and the impact they had on both society and culture at large, we want to dive deeper into the mythology of horses in American history, and more specifically, the Wild West. Grab your saddle and shiniest pair of spurs, and ride like the wind with us out of the stables and into the open air of the western frontier, home of the free and land of the horses. Every school student across the United States learns of the country's history in one fashion or another. In most cases, these elementary history courses state that horses have not been native to the United States throughout history, but are rather here as a result of Europe's colonization of the Western world and the Columbian Exchange. On one hand, these statements are correct. Horses were not prevalent in America for thousands of years, until they arrived first with Christopher Columbus in 1493, found in areas such as present-day Mexico, Panama, Brazil, Peru, and Argentina. The first horses wouldn't even touch the mainland of the future United States until 1519, when Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés brought with him 16 hand-picked horses from back home in Spain. On the other hand, however, horses have roots in the land called America dating back tens of millions of years ago. The first version of the modern-day horse was called the Eohippus. Its fossils were found along the Wind River in Wyoming. However, the true ancestors of the horse, under the genus called Equus, are the Hagerman horses. These early horses natively roamed the Old World as recently as 3.5 million years ago, with its descendants and various relatives found in higher populations as recently as 2.5 million years ago. As recently as 2005, new discoveries and various studies around North America have led researchers to believe that Equus ferus, or simply wild horses, have actually lived on the continent since 10 to 12,000 years ago. These findings were reported after fossils were dug up in Western Canada. Canada was also home to a very recent study in 2021 that suggested modern horse ancestors were around in the present-day Yukon Territory just 6,000 years ago. Through this line of thinking, researchers are starting to wonder if horses might be North American native animals in modern times. Plenty of more research is underway, as are more studies and excavations across the northern regions of the continent. Similar research is also being done to investigate the opposite and more widely accepted theory, that the native horses to North America actually went extinct 2.5 million years ago. This loss is attributed to the Quaternary extinction event that ended the proliferation of most megafaunal species, which include all large-sized animals of the time period, including all under the Equus genus. What caused the Quaternary extinction event is also still up to debate. Theories range from climate change to overhunting by early humans to the complete loss of vegetation due to flips in the ecosystem. It should be noted that all of these horses and their ancestors are wild horses and not domesticated horses. Domesticated horses weren't a thing until about 6,000 years ago, when early Europeans mastered the art near present-day Ukraine. These domesticated horses were then utilized by cultures all over the world, first west into the rest of modern-day Europe, then eastward into the heart of Asia, and the lands of its countless empires. In 1493, domesticated horses finally made their return to the Americas, first introduced to South and Central America by Christopher Columbus, followed by Florida and North America in 1538 by Spanish conquistadors. The first of the domesticated horses to return to North America and roam the open plains or grassy hillsides were colonial Spanish horses, or at least a breed directly descended from this ancestral stock. At first, these Spanish equines dominated the southeast region of America, first in Spanish-occupied territory like modern-day Florida, before migrating west. As the Spanish presence on the southwestern frontier grew, so did the horse populations, especially in areas stretching from modern-day Texas to California. The colonial Spanish horses then prevailed throughout these countrysides for the next 300 years, as New Spain ruled the Pacific Southwest. As more and more Spaniards flocked to the Americas, more and more horses made their way away from the domesticated settlements and back into the wild. This was a result of a few contributing factors. First off, with the discovery of a new land by Europeans came the need for scouting parties to venture off into the unexplored and establish new settlements. If a scouting party or settlement failed, or the human members of these posses were killed off, the horses would have nowhere else to turn to being so far from home, other than retreating into the wild. Second off, horses were seen as valuable pieces of property, and without physical currency or possessions of higher value, many European pioneers saw their horses stolen. These thefts were carried out either by fellow pioneers or nearby tribes of Native Americans. After the horses were stolen, the thief often was ill-equipped to care for and utilize the horse. Thus, many stolen equines were released into the wild. As a result of both patterns, it didn't take long before a contingent of feral horses started growing all along the southern border of the modern-day United States. Feral horses are any free-roaming equine that comes from a domesticated stock, and are the direct ancestors for any wild horse found in America to this day. The biggest beneficiary to the increase in feral horses were Native Americans, and more specifically, the tribes located on the Great Plains and in the rural southwest regions of the countryside. At first, Native Americans were not susceptible to horse culture when horses first arrived in the 16th century. While feral horse populations grew almost immediately after arrival, learning to tame and ride the creatures was no easy feat. Without a means to train themselves the ways of the horse, most indigenous tribes scoffed at their usefulness and lived alongside the animals rather than in conjunction with them. That's not to say Native Americans of a pre-colonial United States never engaged with the newfound equines. A few rogue tribes or passionate warriors may have learned the basics, but there was never enough of a stable contingent to call any indigenous tribe a horse culture before. That wouldn't come until the 18th century. After the horse trade blossomed from a highly successful trading center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, the Comanche were reportedly the first tribe of Native Americans to inquire about their potential for indigenous societies. The introduction of the horse completely changed both the landscape of the Comanche's way of life and the way of life for Native Americans as a whole. Horses allowed for more mobility, both in terms of hunting and warfare. Getting from places in a much shorter time frame also revolutionized trade amongst native groups, as well as between the indigenous and European settlers. These changes brought forth a huge nomadic shift in the overall culture of Native Americans. Big game hunting became so much easier with the use of horses, and the foraging and gathering of the past quickly transformed into communities based around using horses for bison hunts. It also allowed the Comanche to completely change the way they interacted with their enemies. With horses, the Comanche could successfully conduct more raids on larger scales, while establishing their borders with increased security. Of course, along with horses came a few disadvantages. The biggest problem was a major increase in camp sizes and the attention demanded by taking care of such large collections of horses. While it forced the Comanche to expand their encampments and share resources with the large equines, they felt it was a necessary trade-off. The rewards outweighed the risks through the 19th century, and might have been the biggest reason why the Comanche and their fellow tribesmen lasted as long as they did on the western frontier. After the Comanche embraced the horse culture, a few other notable tribes followed. In 1742, there are records that indicate both the Crow and Blackfoot adopted horses, but other scholars argue their usage came much earlier. By the mid-19th century, most Plains Indians featured horses amongst their peoples, especially in warrior bands and hunting parties. However, at this point in the development of the West, horses were found all over the country, including farther north with First Nations tribes in Canada. Back on the frontier, cowboys were another big beneficiary of horses. Horses were seen as working animals and could be found on both ranches and out in the wild during cattle drives, as cowboys would ride them for transportation. Horses were also heavily favored in cities, as they could be used to pull freight, assist with labor, and drive carriages or other horse-drawn mechanisms for widespread transportation. Some couriers made horses integral on the western frontier, such as scouts for wagon trains and migrating parties. Bounty hunters and lawmen required horses to conduct large-scale investigations and chase down outlaws, who were also savvy horseback riders. With the lengthy distances between settlements, towns, and cities, and the railroad system not fully developed across the US, horses were also mandatory for moving cross-country, for the postal service, and security. Of course, who the security was for was dependent on the side you fought on, regardless if you were a pioneer or immigrant or Native American. Even though the Industrial Revolution hit America's Atlantic coastal cities first, many manufacturers and other laborers favored horses over their steam power technology. It wasn't until the horrible working conditions were made a massive public concern that regulations were mandated in major markets, such as in New York in the East and Chicago in the Midwest. The true decline of horses as modes of transportation and labor didn't come until the early 20th century, after World War I had ended. By this point, trains, planes, and automobiles had captured the transportation industry by storm, and with the technological developments that were born out of the Great War, horses were seen as no longer necessary. This was coupled by the assimilation of Native Americans on reservations, where their personal connection with horses and the horse culture at large transitioned alongside the rest of the country. Meanwhile, the United States Department of Agriculture recognized the need for research spaces. This was seen as a way to preserve what had become a rich collection of American horse breeds that now called the United States home. While their demand in agriculture and military studies dropped by the 1920s, they became subjects of recreational efforts to keep horse culture alive. By the 1960s, horses had once again become a point of huge appeal amongst Americans, as thoroughbred horse racing had become a national sensation. In addition, horseback riding and the upkeep of equines in general is now a favorite pastime for many, both in the States and abroad. As of 2013, the Bureau of Land Management announced that there were around 80,000 feral horses left in the United States. Many of these are found on islands along the Atlantic coast, such as Cumberland Island in Georgia or the Outer Banks of North Carolina. And of course, Mustangs and domesticated horses still roam the prairies and plains of the western frontier, as do breeds in the Rocky Mountains and flats of the American Southwest. While horse culture isn't the same as it once was, history of the Wild West and the frontier at large wouldn't be what it is without horses. They may be forgotten pieces to a time period bursting with change, but never forget that change wouldn't be possible without them.